Good morning. I'm Mike Smith, and this is a topical Bible study on the subject of self-control. We're going through the fruits of the Holy Spirit and seeing what the Bible has to say about the different ones. And in Paul's letter to the Galatians, chapter 5, verses 22 and 23, he lists the fruits of the Holy Spirit. Self-control is the last one he lists. So let's take a look and see both what he has to say about it and how this particular theme seems to appear in other places in the Bible. The Greek word that Paul uses for self-control, egartia, and that word is made up, it's a compound word made up of two other words, krat, which means power, eg, which means within, and so the word literally means it is a power within us to control what is within us. Very quickly, there are some Hebrew words also for self-control in the Old Testament. These words are particularly helpful for us, I think, when it comes to thinking about self-control and the dynamic of self-control in our own lives. There's the Hebrew word mashal, which means to govern. There's the Hebrew word larua. The word ruah, the root there, ruah, is also the word which is used for spirit, as in the Holy Spirit and the wind. And so larua has the connotation of being a spirit within us, which helps take authority and govern our lives. There's the Hebrew word motzer, which means to hinder, as in hindering our various impulses so that we can not be carried away by them. And there is the Hebrew word tafak, which means to pull it and bind it together. In other words, get it together, pull yourself together. When we think about stories of self-control, one of the stories that comes to my mind is that of Cain and Abel. From Genesis 4, two brothers, and Cain is very angry with his brother Abel. He becomes very jealous of him, and the impulses that he has inside of him are very dangerous. And so when God sees how difficult a time Cain is having, in fact, physically Cain is demonstrating that that things are out of control in him. His face is fallen. God warns Cain that he must govern, that Hebrew word mashal, the feelings that are inside of him, or he's going to be eaten by them. In other words, it's essential that Cain practice self-control in the midst of what he's feeling. But, of course, he's not able to do that, and the story has a very sad ending. When we look to the book of Exodus, we see there the 10 Commandments, and a number of these commandments require that we be able to practice self-control. Do not murder means that we really have to be careful about those feelings that maybe cause us to want to strangle somebody. Do not commit adultery. We have to watch those feelings of lust that could lead to this. Do not steal. We have to hold in check our feelings of greed and desire to accumulate things. Do not bear false witness against your neighbor. We have to be really careful that we resist those impulses that would have us attack a neighbor. I think maybe one of the hardest of the commandments of all, do not covet. All of these commandments requiring a degree of self-control. Of course, the Proverbs have some teachings about self-control in them. Chapter 25, verse 28 of the Proverbs, like a city breached without walls is one without self-control. In other words, if we have no self-control, we're wide open to destruction, and of course it won't particularly be destruction from somebody else or somewhere else, but we will destroy ourselves from within. And then from the 16th chapter of Proverbs, verse 32, there's this proverb which indicates that it takes more strength to govern one's anger and one's temper than it does to control perhaps an army of 100 men. One who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and one whose temper is controlled than one who captures a city. Jesus has quite a bit to say about self-control in the Sermon on the Mount. In that particular dissertation, he lists a number of things that tend to go on inside of us that need to be controlled. He says, if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. This section of the Sermon on the Mount deals with the the presence of lust inside of us and the need to have control over those particular dynamics. Love your enemies. Well, that requires quite a bit of self-control, because oftentimes the feelings and impulses we have toward our enemies really do require quite a bit of effort to bring them in a direction where we're actually loving those people. There's a need to control our tendency to want to do things for show, particularly with the practice of religion. A lot of times we like the compliments we get. We like for people to think that we're somebody because of our religiosity. But Jesus says we have to control that tendency to want to strut our religion and our faith. When you give alms, do not blow your trumpet. When you pray, go into your room and shut your door. When you fast, do not do so to be seen by others. Some more self-control stuff from the Sermon on the Mount. We all always have to be able to try to hold in check this tendency to accumulate things and this desire we have for money, the love of money. Jesus says, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth. Holding some of those impulses in control there. Do not worry about yourself or about tomorrow. In other words, Jesus is saying we have to have some self-control when it comes to worrying all the time. Well, that's a pretty big one. And if we could just stop worrying about ourselves and about tomorrow, well, that would cover most of what we worry about there, wouldn't it? Do not judge others. That tendency to define, categorize, stereotype, to condemn other people. Jesus says we have to control that tendency to do that. There are places in the New Testament, several places, which indicate that people who lead in the church need to demonstrate self-control. And I picked just one of these places, Titus chapter 1, verses 7 and 8. It says there that a bishop, which would have been a leader of the church in a particular city, must not be arrogant or quick-tempered or addicted to wine or violent or greedy for gain. So we see some other things here about self-control, the addiction to wine, the tendency to violence, the greed, the temper. All of these things are areas of life that have to be controlled. And once a person is able to do that, we begin to see a profile emerge of somebody who's hospitable, a lover of goodness, prudent, upright, devout, and self-controlled. The self-controlled there, the word of the day. We can't get off of the subject of self-control without saying a word about James. James loves to talk about the self-control as it pertains to the tongue. He says, for every species of beast and bird, of reptile and sea creature, everyone can be tamed and has been tamed by the human species, but no one can tame the tongue, a restless evil full of deadly poison. So James really does identify that one of the very hardest things for us to control is how we talk, our tongue. And we might add to that these days that it's not just the control of the tongue, but one of the things that we see is what happens when people get a computer and learn how to use email, and how that can get out of control, and the kind of evil and poison that can be put out over that. So if James were writing today, he'd probably say not only is the tongue something that is really difficult to control, but so are the fingers when it comes to typing emails. Another place in James, he says, if any think they are religious but do not bridle their tongues, their religion is worthless. And another thing in the book of James, kind of along those lines, beloved, do not grumble against one another. There's this need to control our tendency to be negative and to grumble. So what we see in the Bible is pretty much, I think, up to this point, what we would expect to see, and that is the Bible writers think that self-control is a good idea, and we ought to try to have more of it in our lives and in our communities. But as I'm thinking about self-control in the Bible, one of my questions is, does the Bible really have anything unconventional to say about self-control? And particularly, I am thinking about self-control, and I have some questions that so far the scriptures we've looked at, they don't really address. I want to know, why does self-control sometimes elude us the harder we try to have self-control? The more sometimes that we force ourselves to make changes and to control certain behaviors, attitudes, or actions, sometimes it just seems like the further away we get to being the kind of people we want to be. I also am curious as to why some individuals who can be extraordinarily self-controlled in some areas of life are out of control in other areas of life. And I'd also like to know whether self-control is always self-generated, or are there times that self-control, the power to control ourselves, is a power that comes from elsewhere. So some of these questions have not been answered yet in the text that we've looked at. And I'd like to finish this Bible study by looking at 3 more texts which get into addressing some of these issues of curiosity that I have. Paul, I think, does traffic in these tough questions, and he does it in the 7th chapter of Romans. He really begins to get into some of the stuff that I'm interested in, of the hard issues of self-control. He says this: I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing that I hate. That's what I've been looking for here, because if we have self-control, if we've accomplished self-control, then we don't need a lot of biblical teaching. The areas where we really would like to, where we need to draw from the Bible, are those areas where we're struggling to get self-control. And here we see that Paul is confessing to some of the very same situations in his own life that we have. He also says this in the 7th chapter of Romans: I can will what is right, but I cannot do it. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. And he said, wretched man that I am, who will rescue me from this body of death? And he set us up here for that remarkable 8th chapter of Romans by saying that self-control really does come, the power, the energy to practice self-control really does come from beyond us. We have to look to God in order to be able to find that strength and that energy for self-control. In the epistle of 2 Peter, there's also an interesting presentation of the issue of self-control. Let me set it up a little bit here. In 2 Peter, there are a variety of, we're in the 1st chapter of 2 Peter, there are a variety of virtues that are listed, such as righteousness and knowledge and goodness and mutual affection, and self-control is listed as one of those virtues. And in this particular epistle, the writer is saying that these virtues must be fed. And let's take a look at what he says here. You must make every effort to support, and I'm going to say a word about that, the Greek word behind the word support, in just a moment here, because it literally has to do with feeding. You must make every effort to support or feed your faith with goodness, to feed, and then that word is implied here in the rest of this list, to feed your goodness with knowledge, to feed your knowledge with self-control, to feed your knowledge of self-control with endurance. And it moves on then into godliness and mutual affection and love. So that word support, that's a pretty long word there, and I'm kind of afraid to say it because I'm probably going to mispronounce it there. But that Greek word for support, epikoregesata, means literally to feed the choir. It's kind of it has an interesting history for that word, and you have to feed the choir or they won't sing. You have to pay the piper. You have to somehow, if there are some good things in our lives, we have to nurture them. They can't just be taken for granted. And so what this section of 2 Peter is saying is that we have to nurture self-control. And notice in the list here in this particular verse, these particular verses, that self-control is particularly nurtured with godliness and mutual affection and love. So this is, I think, a very important teaching. And another thing that's interesting, I think, about this passage is that self-control is nurtured by things that we might often think to be the opposite. Mutual affection. It's actually nurtured by strong friendships and love. It's nurtured by our care for people and the world that are around us. And so it may sound a little counterintuitive that if we want to have more self-control, that we need to nurture that with some attitudes, postures, activities, and commitments in our lives, which may seem to be the opposite of self-control. Okay, we're back to Galatians 5:23, where Paul asserts that self-control is ultimately a gift of God. It's one of the fruits of the Holy Spirit. And so, if self-control is a gift of God, I think that Christians have a message more than just, hey, everybody, you have to try harder. I think Christians have a complexity to their understanding of self-control. It needs to be nurtured. It's something that can be depleted, so it has to be nurtured. It also is something that self-control is something that is not particularly automatic, and we can have self-control in some areas, as Paul did, and really struggle with self-control in other areas. I think for Christians, we realize that we should not have pride in our self-control. In fact, the more proud we are of our self-control, sometimes the more intolerant and ungracious we can be with other people who are still struggling, where we've maybe already achieved a victory. And as the Proverbs say, pride goeth before a fall. We know as Christians that the source of better living is always God, and while we try to do all that we can, ultimately we depend on God and those little miracles and those gifts that God gives us to help get us through the day. God is also the one who gives us a balance of gifts. Sometimes when we're too focused on self-control in one area, God can look at our whole lives and see that maybe the thing that we're obsessed with, and sometimes self-control can very easily tip into obsessive and compulsive behavior, and God perhaps can see that maybe self-control that is an obsession of ours in some particular area is not what we really need for the fullness and the abundance of life. So, just some thoughts from the Bible on the subject of self-control. Feel free to write some comments in the website in the section below and get a little conversation started if you'd like. Thank you for being a part of this.